What I'd like to do now is introduce you to 3 new and emerging advocates. This is the next generation of advocates in Australia who will be leading us through the miasma of unresolved disability issues that will come about long after I have turned to dust. And thank goodness that we do have new and emerging advocates who can continue to carry the torch. So going from our left, we have Bree O'Dwyer, who is just up the front, Youth Disability Advocacy Service. I won't introduce you other than to give you your names and your titles, or where you're from. And then I have Cee in the middle from Women with Disabilities ACT. And on my end, closest to me, is Brendon Donohue from Queensland. And so, Bree, we'll start with you, and I'll give you a microphone.
Thank you, Patrick. So I was told to collate a personal story on the events, influences, people or motivation that brought me to becoming an advocate. I think what I'll do is, if Patrick doesn't mind, I might stand at the lectern just because I've got notes and might be a bit awkward otherwise. Hi, can everyone see me? Kind of, or hear me?
Oh, I can't see it.
Great, thanks, Brendon. So firstly, I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people whose lands were stolen and never ceded, and pay my respects to past and present elders who are here today or around. I am currently the Youth Disability Advocate at the Youth Disability Advocacy Service under the Youth Affairs Council of Victoria. It's quite a mouthful. But basically, I am the disability advocate in Victoria who supports young people between the ages of 12 and 25, specifically representing the young person's interests. So it's what they want that I deal with. So I started in advocacy about 2 months ago. So admittedly, I'm still very much learning. But my desire to become a disability advocate, either formally or informally, started years ago. So I wasn't born with a disability, and the disabilities I have are what we all know as invisible disabilities. I have Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune condition, and fibromyalgia, which is a pain condition. So I've always been a bit of a high achiever, a type A style of person. Went to a high school that encouraged me to keep striving. However, they weren't so great when things started to become difficult for me. I started with fatigue, immense fatigue. My ability to wake up in the morning, get ready, go to school became severely diminished. I spent a lot of time in bed, sleeping, studying, and I didn't understand what was happening to me. I thought that I was just lazy, a feeling that I know many people with fatigue-inducing conditions are all too familiar with. The first time I even went to a doctor about it all was because we were studying vitamins in my biology class. And as we were reading the symptoms of having iron and B12 deficiencies, my teacher clicked and suggested maybe I should get tested for those. He was onto something because I was so low, I started receiving injections of B12 by the school nurse. But school was no longer a positive place for me. The teachers who taught me were great, but all the others were rude and presumptive, talking about me to their classes, calling me a part-time student. This was a particularly cruel insult at such an academically high-achieving school. In our yearbook, I won the Where Are They award. No awards were voted on. It was chosen by the teacher who organised the yearbook content. Their cruelty and lack of empathy, compassion and support made me feel isolated, unwelcome and like a problem student. I am incredibly lucky to have such supportive parents though, who encouraged me to do just what I could and they would be proud of me. I ended up doing actually pretty well, so hurdle jumped. But the struggle with education for me wasn't over. I started a Bachelor of Arts and struggled considerably. Every assignment resulted in panic attacks and deductions for lateness. every single one of them. I completed my degree 6 months early by taking summer and winter classes. Having a break was not something I understood, especially coming from my high school environment. So second hurdle jumped, the boot touched it, but I made it over. At that point, other than having a B12 deficiency in high school, I didn't think anything was up. Again, I just thought I was lazy. So since I was about 15, I'd presented on and off to the local GP with concerns regarding my health. As a teenager, I was not particularly keen to discuss the particulars. For those that don't know, Crohn's is a bowel disease, but I knew something was off, and I didn't get diagnosed for another 6 years when I showed up at an emergency ward having lost a lot of blood. They booked me in for tests, but fortunately my mum had private health insurance for me. So by the time I was meant to have those tests on the public system, I had been diagnosed and begun treatment. And then I decided to move to London. Excellent idea. I had been diagnosed for 4 months by the time I had decided to flit off over to the other side of the world. I had to get on the NHS, connect with a specialist in St Bart's who was a colleague of my specialist at home, except I didn't live in that catchment area. So a few months, lots of letter writing and frustration, and getting pretty sick, I then saw him. He was okay, but the best part was the IBD nurse. I've never had such timely support for my Crohn's before or since. I could email her how I was feeling, and she would give a recommendation to change my treatment by email within the day. Then I came home and started law school. I was armed with a diagnosis, and I was going to use it. The best thing I found there was the wellbeing coordinator, Kate. She knew what was up. She sorted everything she could to help me to get through, and she did it with the dark sense of humour that this was not her first rodeo. The law school, however, didn't record lectures. They still don't. I had to rely on classmates to help me, which was pretty awkward as a strain on a new friendship in such a competitive arena. It was during law school that I started to actually identify as a person with a disability. I learned that my experience was valid, that it was real, and that it fit within legislative definitions. So I used it. I applied for scholarships. I secured an internship through the Australian Network on Disability at the newly established NDIS in Canberra. This was in 2015. The experience was life-altering. I was in the legal division, my access needs were met, and I was being mentored and trusted to do my work. My supervising lawyer, Shelley, has been a strong support to me ever since. I also signed up for the first ever Disability Human Rights Clinic subject at Melbourne Law School. I got to see the law and disability collide. It was exciting and infuriating to see the power of the law over the lives of people with disabilities. I'd always wanted to be an advocate. In my application to law school, I told a story about how being an advocate, a person who stands up for what's right, was ingrained in me. My mum tells the story about when I was 2, when I stood in between 2 bigger boys and one who had been hurt before and the other who had inflicted it. I refused to let the bully through, and I've been trying to do that ever since. My experiences and my access needs are what brought me into the disability advocacy space. I studied to be an administrative lawyer. Much more interesting than it sounds. It's dealing with government departments and entitlements like Centrelink and the NDIS. Okay, it's probably not actually exciting. And I was looking into changes to sexual offences legislation, not disability. But because I am disabled, a lot of my workplaces have been disabling. I was talking to Mary before about my experiences in the workplace after finishing law school, and this is the first time in my life that my disability is not making my pay deducted. I don't have to... I finally have a reliable paycheck because I am able to work the way I can and need to. this is huge for me. I'm actually really excited to have a reliable paycheck and be able to save. I am 29. That should not be how I feel right now. I should have had a reliable paycheck that hasn't had my disability deducted. And I shouldn't have had to lose sick leave because of my disability. So since law school, I've completed a graduate diploma, been admitted as a lawyer, and I've had a few jobs. Those jobs, they were like returning to high school. I was re-traumatised all over again. There was no trust in me or appropriate support. I returned to feeling isolated and unwelcome and incapable of doing my best. So I'm here where my access needs are met and they allow me to finally do the work that I am capable of. As a disability advocate working specifically with young people, I see the value of their group. Those important people who believed in them and helped them and saw their potential and found a way to harness it. My teachers, the law school wellbeing coordinator, Kate, my supervisor, Shelley, these are people who supported me, who weren't my friends or my family, but my role models. So while being a disability advocate is not where high school Bree thought she'd be, I've become who she needed. That's the end of that part. That's how I became an advocate. Am I meant to go to the next part or?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes? Cool. So we were also asked to talk about an issue that we were passionate and committed to. Now, admittedly, I'm very new to the space and I thought I'd talk about my preliminary observations since becoming an advocate. Consistent throughout all of my cases with individual advocacy is a lack of clarity in language, in procedures, and in support. So by far, my most popular area of individual advocacy is in education. I deal mostly with high schools, however, primary and tertiary students aren't completely absent from my work. I'm constantly struggling to navigate the bureaucracy of it all, which being a lawyer, I never thought I would have a problem with. The bureaucracy is so ingrained in the structures of our education system. Each school has their own rules, policies, procedures, and approval method. Then the department has its own rules, policies, and procedures that need to be adhered to. The sheer number of different kinds of meetings that can take place, that all have different acronyms, slightly different purposes, and all take forever to be approved and funded once agreed upon. Education is a human right, and currently that right is being obstructed for young disabled people by the system itself. Bureaucracy is disabling. The bureaucracy is drafted for the people in charge. It's not there to help the people who use it. The language is complicated, the process circular, and just when you think all the hoops are jumped, the next procedure begins and you have to start all over again. Not only is the bureaucracy disabling because of its complexity, it's particularly difficult to navigate for young people. This is the time in their life for figuring out who they are or who they want to be, about understanding the world and their place in it. They are vulnerable because of their youth, their disability, and their inexperience with such systems. The risk that they take on the flaws of these systems as their own problems to solve is great. My own experiences in school and my time with clients find me frustrated with the lack of understanding of the importance of an accessible education for everyone. Funding that is specifically to provide this accessibility can also be used for the rest of the school. I found this provision to be particularly concerning. Schools understandably want to use the funding to benefit their entire student body. However, with that in mind, they often neglect the vitality of student funding to provide access to the student with the disability first. It would be great to share an aid, but in a lot of circumstances, students require the aid one-to-one. Students with disability end up having their access sacrificed for the betterment of the rest of the school. But a utilitarian model like this has no place interfering in the right of a child to have an education. As Senator Jordan Steele-John said earlier today, how we currently fund education is fundamentally flawed. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bree. Cee, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to do Brendon next. If I could get this microphone. So Brendon and I are going to, pardon me. Brendon and I are going to have a conversation, if that's okay with everybody. So let me introduce you to Brendon Donohue, not O'Donoghue. I keep saying that. I'm sorry about that. Brendon's from. Tell us where you're from, Brendon.
Okay, I'm from Brisbane, in South Brisbane, and I live independently.
Great. And how old are you?
I am 26.
26. Tell us about growing up with a disability. What was your disability?
Okay, so I grew up with total blindness, which affects my ability to be able to see. So I don't have the same, ability as somebody that can see, but I have a lot of other abilities in other ways. So I went through to a normal mainstream primary school with a unit attached, where I was able to get some of the supports that I needed in order to complete education. Then I moved along into high school, which is where I really flourished. I had a really supportive high school who supported me in being able to do a lot of interesting things, such as employment, such as being able to undertake study in areas that I'd never studied before. And then and they supported me a lot in life skills and being able to move out into my own home independently at the age of 18.
Tell us a little bit about that, about moving out of home. I mean, you can't see, you're living independently, you're moving out of home. How was that? How did you overcome those challenges?
I overcame a lot of those challenges by really sticking up for me and my rights. So really doing a lot of research into what is my right as a person with a disability who is moving out of home independently. So I was able to question a lot of people when they came to me and said, oh no, you can't do that, or no, it's improper for you to do that, or think about that again. I always had a retaliation mark for those people to lead me into what I wanted to do with my life.
And did you have family support through that time?
I had a small amount of family assistance, but I wanted to do it all myself. So I had support people along the way that assisted me and drove the furniture van for me. So obviously me driving a furniture van would be seen as being extremely dangerous on the open road. So that was something I certainly did need some assistance with, and was able to effectively do that without injuring me or the support person.
And so you live in your own flat, do you?
Yes, I live in a communal housing setting, which is known as Brisbane Common Ground, which is actually modelled on a New York setting, which is to provide people independent living, but with supported accommodation. So we have security and we have support personnel available when we need them 24/7, but it is independent, so we can go and leave and do what we like. So it was time for me to enjoy life and not being told to do something that I didn't want to do.
Gosh, can you imagine trying to tell Brendon to do anything he doesn't want to do? I don't think I can.
I would probably ignore them, and I would probably go, well, you're just stupid and I'm going to do it anyway.
Exactly. So let me turn now to the focus of your work, because you're a bit of a warrior when it comes to making complaints under the DDA, aren't you?
Yes. So disability discrimination complaints under the DDA, I am quite famous of doing. I've done around 5 or 6, I think now at the moment, of my counting.
So that's 6 DDA complaints you've made?
Yes.
Right. So anybody wanting to know a little bit about how to make a DDA complaint can come to you for advice?
Absolutely. You can come to me and I'll talk your ear off around the process and how it's been.
Talk our ear off about the first time you made a DDA complaint. What happened, and what was the process, and what were the outcomes?
So the first time I made a DDA complaint was when I got a very welcoming piece of news to me at the time, which was my local bank was to bring bank statements online to anyone that wanted to read them. So previously I'd had to use a scanning device to read my bank statements, and I was very happy to hear that they were going online. Disappointing to me when they actually lodged them online, they were in a completely PDF with a graphical picture of the bank statement. So for people that don't know, when you read a graphical PDF with a screen reader, all it says is blank, 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 blank. So you have no idea what is on the page. So it was incredibly frustrating to me to have that placed upon me. So I did the usual thing. I ring the bank and to the customer service complaints line, and I say, I'm really disappointed about this. And I was met with a very disappointing response, which was, well, you can pay for a support person to come in and read your bank statement to you. Now, obviously, that was entirely inappropriate, and I ended that phone call. And then I had to undergo a lot of research. So I jumped on the internet and researched on, well, how do I actually do a DDA complaint? Because I did feel like I had been discriminated against, but I did not know where to go and get the information or how to make this process happen. So I was able to do a lot of research and read a lot of stuff, and then was able to then contact my local community centre for advice, and then I went on to lodging the complaint with the help of the Human Rights Commission, and basically the bank just crumbled underneath me, and even before the conciliation, they had made an appropriate alteration to those bank statements, which is still available today in where I can read them. So it was a successful process because I knew what to do, and I came in very strongly and said, no, this was not right, and you guys need to fix it.
So how did that, I think that deserves a round of applause, actually. How did you feel after that? Like, what was that like, winning against a bank?
I felt incredibly, I just felt like, wow, I can read this bank statement, and I was able to read, my ingoing and outgoing payments. So in one way it was good, but in another way it was really terrible because I could see how much money I was, how much money was going in and out of my bank account. So it was great in a sense, but terrible in another, because I actually couldn't fake anymore that I didn't know how much I was spending.
So you've gone on to make a number of DDA complaints. What's been the most helpful thing for you about making a DDA complaint? Where do you get your help, and who do you get that help from?
I think the one thing you have to be with a DDA complaint is incredibly patient, and you have to keep stating your position, even though you may think that it's right, and it's right, and you just have to be very guiding and just not lose your head, even though you want to a lot of the time, and you just want to go, well, this is just a stupid process and that sort of thing. But being calm and restating that you're unhappy in your position. And the Human Rights Commission has a process in where that if you're not very wanting to write up your complaint, they will actually do it for you. So that was one of the things I found very early from doing a lot of my research into the process. Well, they will actually do it for you, and you can actually you can actually tell them what to write down for you, and and then you can get them to read it back to you. So it's a very easy and a non-demeaning experience.
So having taken on a bank and won, you next scaled the heights of the multinationals. Tell us about the Seek.com DDA complaint.
Yes, so the Seek.com complaint was very large. It is actually still going more than 2.5 years after lodging the first DDA complaint. It was around my ability not being able to access the job apply form when applying for jobs in the way that any other ordinary person without a disability would be able to access it. So Seek made a number of disappointing changes to the site, which basically made the website completely mouse-driven, and you were not able to access it via a keyboard. So again, I lodged the complaint, and we went this time to conciliation. I find conciliation a very good process, but also very hard process in that you've got to, again, really be very confident in what you're complaining about and knowing that you're right, and and for you not to get swallowed up by the other party in that they want you to crumble underneath them. So this one was completely won by me outright, in that they had failed to provide me with an accessible website, and they were really surprised that blind people actually look for work. They were very, very shocked and horrified to find out that a disability pension was not a suitable amount of money for me to live on, and they were shocked and horrified to find out that I actually wanted to look for a job. You know, shock horror, we actually do want to work around here. And the disappointing thing that led on to that was Seek continued to make ongoing changes to their website, which led to further issues for me not to be able to access it. And again, I had to lodge another complaint, which almost from a day nearly ended up in the federal court. But a day before that was meant to happen, Seek actually said, no, we will fix it. And they have actually made inroads at the moment into possibly making their site completely accessible. But it has been a very long and drawn out process, but a process that had results, even though they have been slow and painful. The results have been made, and anyone who has a visual impairment can now go on the Seek website, no matter what browser you use. Internet Explorer, Firefox or Chrome can successfully apply for a job, as before they were unable to apply for a job at all.
Well, you know, never fails to astonish me how impressed I can be by people. And Brendon, you're a very impressive individual. If everybody could join me in a round of applause, please. Thank you very much, Brendon Donohue.
And feel free, anyone that wants to pick my brain about the DDA. I'm jumping on a plane this evening to leave Melbourne. Melbourne has been great. The weather has been very friendly to me. I packed about 3 jackets and 3 lots of long pants, but I've only needed to use one of them. So Melbourne has been very gratefully received by me.
Thank you, Brendon. The last but not yet question from the audience. Brendon, hang on. Quick question.
Just a quick question. Brendon, was your DDA complaint through federal or state?
The question was the DDA complaint through federal or state?
The Seek ones and the bank ones, they were through the state. I have done others through the federal, but the state has been where I've mainly stuck to.
Great. All right, our last new and emerging advocate, and last but certainly not least, is Cee. And Cee is the CEO or Executive Director, I can never work out which one. CEO, I'm glad, there you go, of Women with Disabilities in the ACT. Did you want to come and stand up here, or are you happy to sit down there?
I'd prefer to sit.
No, you go right ahead. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Cee, and I know my name's unusual, it is just the letter. I use they, them pronouns. I'm genderqueer, or that's a non-binary gender identity, so I'm transgender and disabled, and that's a really fun intersection. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation, and thank them for having us on this land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I was born and raised on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people in Canberra, and so I've lived around politicians my entire life, and I'm the child of public servants, so that's how I speak. I'm very sorry. I started in advocacy as a teenager. I was 14 when I joined my school board. At this time, I'd already been diagnosed with severe anxiety and depression, which are with me even now, and endometriosis. So that was the beginning of my journey with disability. I wasn't happy with how my school was handling mental illness for myself and my friends, because of course we all ended up running in the same circles. And a lot of my friends with mental health challenges weren't willing to work with authority figures. But as the child of public servants, that wasn't something that scared me, and I acknowledged the privilege that I had there and decided, well, I'm going to do something about it. So one day I jumped on my school board, jumped on my student representative council, and started making an issue out of the way our school looked after mental health issues and health issues in general. So for those of us who were absent from school, they just needed to do better instead of docking our grades when we were sick. I advocated really strongly for better mental health supports, and due to my own medical issues, I made the board more aware of the impact invisible illnesses could have on even the high achievers in school. And because my illnesses were invisible, I had to really make it an issue of I need to be absent and it's because I'm sick to the school administrators. And that started to really turn things around for a lot of students. They started to change the way they administered sick leave for students, and overall some of the school administrators just started to be a lot more friendly and have a much better open door policy. However, when I left high school to move on to college, as we do in the ACT, I learned my first lesson in the sustainability of advocacy. As soon as I left the school, the social work and counselling budgets were cut, and the hours were reduced, offices were closed down, students weren't allowed out of class when they were in crisis, and that directly affected my former classmates and even my own younger brother. So I continued on my school board at my college, but I knew that without training up other younger advocates through the Student Representative Council and other programs, it would all be for naught as soon as I left for uni. So when I got to university, I got a casual job running the student space for the student union at the ANU. We'd give students free breakfast, help them find resources, administer the food aid program, and essentially we'd see students who were on the absolute brink of crisis every day. Now, I was one of those students myself, but because I was experienced that, I wanted to be at the forefront of that advocacy and actually helping students. And that was when I really started to notice the connection between individual and systemic advocacy. I first learnt the word systemic advocacy there and developed my passion for it, because all these students were coming to me with similar issues. I have mental health problems, I have disability issues, and I'm being discriminated against, but the university is not dealing with them properly. So from running this little breakfast program, making sure that people had the food they needed and providing them the resources they needed to go get counselling, I was starting to notice patterns and turned around to the Student Association to say, hey, we need to do better on this. Oh, sorry. It was also at university through one of my student societies where I started to talk about the academics behind the disability advocacy movement. And I first met Sue Salthouse, who's the chair of Women with Disabilities ACT. She actually came to talk to us about the future of disability and advocacy. And the ANU, of course, allocated us an inaccessible lecture theatre. We'd asked for an accessible lecture theatre, but they didn't have any lecture theatres that were accessible for lecturers, only students. The same lecture theatre is still getting allocated as an accessible lecture theatre even now, and that's at one of our top universities. So when I finished my science degree, what had kind of just been a habit of doing advocacy in my spare time became a career. I couldn't stick around in science because of my disabilities. By that stage, I'd also developed rheumatoid arthritis and a fun brain condition called idiopathic intracranial hypertension, which if you Google later, it's fun. I decided that I'd continue this student advocacy stick and moved over to Canberra's equivalent of TAFE, which is CIT, because we like to be pretentious about everything. I had had major health issues, as I mentioned, since I was 14 or so, and I figured, well, while I'm working, I should get into, some side gig advocacy. So I talked to a couple of organisations in Canberra, the Women's Centre for Health Matters and the Healthcare Consumers Association of the ACT. And through them, I came across a couple of fabulous mentors in their CEOs and became a consumer representative in the health sphere. So I ended up speaking to clinicians about how I'd been treated and mistreated because of my gender, how the stigma around chronic pain and around being a woman interacts. And that's where the interaction between gender and disability started to really crystallise for me. And that continued while I was still working in student advocacy. I continued there for about 2 years, specialising in queer and disability advocacy, mainly because that's how I identified and no one else was willing to do it. And then I had to quit that job because they weren't willing to accommodate my disabilities, despite the fact that that was what I was fighting for every single day. I got sicker and sicker because they weren't willing to allow me to sit down when we had fair days. I wasn't able to take time off when I needed to because someone's got to be in the office. And when you're someone living with chronic pain, that's just not good enough. So I got to a point where I thought I was going to be on Centrelink because of the way housing is priced in Canberra. I was looking at being homeless and it looked pretty bleak. But the day after I quit my job, who do I get a call from? Sue Salthouse, offering me a role as the CEO of Women with Disabilities ACT. Becoming a CEO at 23 was not something I ever expected. I'd applied for a job to work on community engagement and membership with ACT. And that was what I was passionate about, working with people on the front lines to help their issues become systemic advocacy. And but I got asked to be a CEO because WIDACT wanted to train up the next generation, which is exactly what we're all here for. And so from there, I've been there 2 years in March. I've had the most amazing women on the board as my mentors. I was also given the opportunity by the ACT government to join the Future Shapers program as part of the Disability Leadership Institute. And I've been able to run our own youth leadership program to bring up other young advocates. So that's my story so far, more to be written. And I'll just quickly give you the issue that I'm absolutely most passionate about. For me, being a trans, gender diverse person with disability is this really tough intersection. I work with gender and disability every day, and I notice the intersection of being a woman with disability, especially in things like violence, the health sector, housing. But trans and gender diverse people are often missing from that dialogue, even though we experience even more violence, even more risk of homelessness, and even higher rates of poverty. I went to one of our local trans and gender diverse support groups in Canberra and started talking about my job. Nearly half the room told me that they identified as disabled or having some kind of mental health condition. And there was no one in Canberra specifically working with those groups. Stats coming out of the US, of course we don't really have any robust ones here, say that about 35% of trans and gender diverse people have a disability. And I suspect that it's probably similar in Australia. Some of the issues that I've found in my community are around gendered medical services not accepting trans people, discrimination from service providers, particularly under the NDIS, which is completely blind to trans people despite it being in the legislation. Being dead named through standard processes, which is where they use someone's previous name, that's really common when applying for the NDIS because they dig up your old medical records. Not getting your identity recognised by Centrelink and Medicare because the standards that are needed to change your identity with them are often higher than they are for state governments. And just finding accessible information and services for transitioning. Most of that information isn't available in accessible formats, certainly not in formats that are certainly not in easy English. And there's limited resourcing for not-for-profits to provide that information currently. So wherever possible, I'm trying in my role to change that language and make sure that we're including gender diversity when we're talking about statistics for people with disability. Because whilst it might seem like a small group of people, adding that extra layer of intersectionality into our work will make a huge difference for a portion of the community. And especially for me, I didn't even realise that I was transgender until I found my own disability pride, because I'd never been allowed to consider that my body could be more than just something that someone was trying to cure. And I think that that's something that a lot of people might identify with. So, in short, I want to make trans people more visible in disability advocacy, and also in queer advocacy, I want to make disabled people more visible, and I'd like to see more of us include that.
Goodness me. Thank you very much, Bree and Cee and Brendon, for three quite remarkable stories that help us understand, I think, the future that's coming our way very quickly and in fact is already here. I'm a bit old now, so I only have to pay attention to the things that I like. And but I am glad that these three are here doing this work and focusing on what's before us. We do have a couple of minutes for any questions. So if anybody has any questions for Brendon, Cee or Bree, I am aware that we're right at the end of the day, and time at this end of the day is obviously something that might prevent people sticking their hands up, but if anybody does, now's the time. Liz.
It's not a question, but I just want to say thank you for sharing your journeys. It's been really, really powerful and super appreciated. So thank you.
Yes, I do think they deserve another round of applause, everybody.